Invite Danny Grander from SNCC to share with us finding of a research they did. Hi, Dan. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Hello, hello. Yes? Yeah, okay. Hello, and thank you all for coming. My name is Danny, and I'm one of the co-founders and responsible for security at SNCC. We're a dev tooling company based here in Tel Aviv and in London, and we're building security tools to help developers use open source code securely. I'm also Capture the Flag player. Anyone here plays Capture the Flag games, the security competitions? No one. Oh, one. Yeah. Two. So yeah, I'm part of the team called Pastan, and we had an honor to win 3 times in a row the CCC Capture the Flags and the Google Capture the Flag competitions. All right, and this is Brian. This is one of the security researchers at SNCC, and he's also a really good boy. And as part of his research project, he took a look at some open source project, basically looking for some vulnerabilities. And I hope you can see the code. This is some Java code. And this is a simple function called unzip. Very simple one, just takes an input of a zip file and a destination folder to where do we want to extract the contents of the zip file, and extracts it. So it goes by creating the zip file object, iterating, basically getting the list of entries from the zip file, the files inside the zip, iterating over them in a while loop, for each entry concatenating the target directory with the entry name inside the zip file, and finally writing it to disk. Anyone can spot a security issue with that code, beside the fact that it's written in Java? 1, 2. Cool, all right, so yeah, I see some hands. So basically, what we see here is a very simple type of vulnerability, and it is in this line of code. Basically, when we concatenate the destination directory with the entry name, the file name that comes from within the zip file, assuming the zip file was provided by an attacker. So let's take a look at an example. Suppose we have this benign, simple backup.zip file. It has a single file inside called backup.txt. So if we call this unzip function with those inputs, basically trying to extract it to /tmp/extracted, we'll just get the backup.txt file extracted to this folder. Everything works as expected. But then if we have this evil backup zip file with this time 2 files, one that old file we have, backup.txt, but the other one is this directory traversing file name with dot slashes, what we'll have is that when those two are concatenated, we end up within the directory that is outside of the destination folder. So obviously, having arbitrary file rights on a file system pretty quickly gives you a lot of control over code, over configurations, and whatnot. So important to say, it's not only for zip files, it actually affects any kind of archives, right? So basically there are archivers and there are compressors. And so for example, zip is both an archiver, so it combines several files together, but it's also a compressor. It makes those files smaller. While tar, for example, is just an archiver, but not a compressor. That's why it's often used with GZ, which is gzip, which is basically just a compressor and not an archiver. So, so what we did when we've seen this code in the Jenkins code base, but also in some of the AWS plugins for Jenkins, we went and scanned all GitHub open source code for this vulnerability. And the result was thousands of affected vulnerable projects. Most of them were Java projects. So this is just a collection of Apache projects that were affected to this vulnerability. And there were plenty others that we can see here. But the thing is also that there were a lot of archiving libraries that dedicated only to extraction and creation of archives that were affected. So there were some in NPM, .NET, Java, Ruby, and Go. So this vulnerability is not new at all. Like, I guess many of you already were familiar with it. And the first time it was mentioned was in the Frack magazine in '91, when basically the internet was burned. And so this vulnerability talked back then about BBSs. Like that's what was the attack attack against the BBSs. And so the question is, like, how come we're 27 years later and like we find thousands of projects affected and major projects? I mean, like, yeah, I've shown some logos of projects, like, you know, coming from Oracle and Pivotal and Apache, and like big open source project. And so we wondered about this because when we looked around in different open source projects, we could see that Java is like the one that affected the most. And so if we look at the way and how we can extract zip archives in Python, so in Python it's very simple. Like basically we just need to import the zip file library and then just call one function, extract all, providing the destination folder. But then for .NET, we have extract to a directory. The same we have like a single function we can call to extract the zip archive. But with Java, we don't have such a function. We don't have this unzip simple function called unzip that can do all the work for us. And Java standard library does not provide us with a simple method we can call, and Apache Commons Compress does not, which is like the most popular compression library for Java coming from Apache. And so what happens is that we either need to write this chunk of code, or we, like many of us developers, end up going to Google and just, you know, writing. Well, this was supposed to be an animation, but basically, what we would see here is that we would write Java unzip file, and we would get like results, and every one of those results, like going down to several pages deep in the Google search results, would show us an implementation that is basically vulnerable. And a lot of the results coming there would be Stack Overflow results, a website we all love and find very useful. And when we looked at the Stack Overflow questions around handling zip and tar and different types of archives, we've seen that actually all of the answers except a single answer we've seen contained a vulnerable implementation. And so that resulted in copy-pasting, right? In copy-pasting of the code from there. So it's interesting to see some comments coming from the users. I'm not sure you can see it, but basically those are folks that renting that, like, it's like 2011, and we still don't have a simple function we can call to extract the zip archive. So in summary, so we call this vulnerability a zip slip. We gave it a name just to raise awareness to the issue, because basically when we looked at the CVEs, historic CVEs, like 27 years old vulnerability, right? And so sometimes it would be called directory traversal. With it, it's not really the vulnerability, it's actually the method, like the issue. Sometimes it would be called arbitrary file write. And so just like the zip bomb, everybody, when we hear zip bomb, we know like this is this generic vulnerability that has to do with denial of service, like compressing a lot of information into a tiny bit of something that compresses well, and then we can send it to a server or something and make it blow. So it's sort of a zip slip is whenever a file slips out of the destination folder. So we've seen basically when we analyzed all the source code, all the open source code, we've seen that some ecosystems are affected. Basically, Java, for example, that doesn't have this high-level API, making developers basically borrow code from other open source project or Stack Overflow. So we have seen many vulnerable snippets floating around. Again, open source projects and Stack Overflow. Some around 10 actual archive extraction libraries that were affected, and then the projects themselves that were just hundreds of projects that were vulnerable. So The challenge here was like the disclosure process. Basically, we have many open source projects that we need to coordinate into to kind of disclose to, make them fix the issue, and it's open source, so everybody can see it, right? And so kind of like they can't do it completely silently, but we would also encourage not to kind of go and make noise before the embargo date, before the final publication date. So we chose the Google Project Zero model, choosing 60 days for the disclosure period, and actually to make this happen, we helped quite a lot of open source maintainers to fix the issue because just they didn't have the resources. We had a Go library that we reached to the maintainer, and he said like, I thank you for reporting the vulnerability, but I wrote this library for my own use 5 years ago. It shouldn't be used in production. And we were like, this is the most popular Go library at the moment on GitHub. And so he wasn't aware to this. And so we ended up helping fixing the issue for him, but also about 5 other libraries just to make it to the publication day. So whenever we go public, everybody would be fixed. So just a long list of CVs. Actually, that also affected the Microsoft PowerShell. The November patch Tuesday, it took them a while to fix, but the .NET framework itself and the PowerShell were affected to this issue as well. These CVs are only some of the open source projects, but there are many more coming. So yeah, we created this GitHub page. So basically to like a collaborative document so people can add affected libraries, affected projects to this list, but also see what libraries are affected and what the fixed version is. So yeah, some kind of 3 takeaways from this thing. Well, API matters. So designing a simplified, secure by default API is very important. Like, we've seen an issue that exists in Java, which is like a pretty mature, old language, right? It's not Node.js when you can say like, hey, this is a new thing, and there's a lot of kind of issues with it, and it's still kind of forming. No, Java is like has a long history, and yet it has this really simple and severe vulnerability, issue that turns into vulnerabilities in many Java applications. While in other languages, like, it's non-existent, basically. So Python, you would not find, for example, a project that is affected to this issue. So 2 ecosystems, same vulnerability. One is like an issue, a real issue. Basically, every project we looked at that deal, and like 95% of the projects we looked at that deal with zip archives had a vulnerable implementation. It doesn't mean it was vulnerable, because not always the zip file will be controlled by the attacker, but the vulnerable implementation was there. So it either can be one day turned into vulnerability because one day somebody would add a feature dealing with zip files coming from the attacker, or this code can be borrowed into other projects. So yeah, secure by default APIs, useful APIs. I mean, it's pretty crazy to think about it, but every person in Java world that wanted to extract a zip archive would go and copy-paste 50 lines of code from Stack Overflow, or sometimes would write those 50 lines of code. So, I mean, like, you just want to open a zip archive. It's not, you don't want to go through like input streams and all of those chaining in the Java world. You just want to simply open a zip archive. So this is interesting thing to see, like 30 years of history in one issue. Second thing is, this is the keyboard that most of the developers can live with, and Stack Overflow is not the issue here really. Stack Overflow is great; it's a great resource, it's a great place to find solutions to your problems. But we need to be mindful when we go there and just copy code from it. So we need to understand what it does. It's just there's many reasons why Stack Overflow is not the best case. So, for example, the most popular answers on Stack Overflow are the shorter answers. So if your code is shorter, like it's something that I can look at and like it falls into a short snippet, it would be upvoted much more than a longer, comprehensive, maybe more secure implementation. So another issue with Stack Overflow is that basically not Stack Overflow generally, but copying snippets into your code, is, for example, if I would copy this extraction, zip extraction snippet into my code, if a vulnerability is found, like this vulnerability, and we go public, we notify, you have no way to know that you have this kind of vulnerability. While if you're using a library, and that library is found vulnerable, and that library releases a new version, then you can be notified that a new release is available. So if you're monitoring your dependencies, you can actually know that you have the issue. So it's also kind of should be a red flag whenever you're copying like pieces of code that longer than, I don't know, several lines that you don't understand. It should be an alarm. Yeah, and finally, do proper archive handling. So first of all, make sure you don't have this vulnerable implementation in your code. Again, it just happens to be that most of the implementation are vulnerable, and it's just, security folks are aware to this issue, but developers are not. So, like, chances are that if a developer implemented this extraction, they didn't think about the traversal thing. So do check if your application deals with zip archives. Do make sure you're not vulnerable. Again, make sure you're not using a vulnerable library that we've seen before. So all of those were fixed by now. But those libraries are dedicated to archive extraction. So you can also check on the link below for the updated versions and other libraries affected. And that's all. We have plenty of time for questions, if there are any, or lunch. Thank you all. Thank you so much.